Okay, thank you to everybody that's just joining, and welcome to today's joint webinar with UKSTT and the Pipeline Industries Guild. My name is Kate Lazenby and I'm the Executive Director of the Pipeline Industries Guild, and I'm really pleased to welcome Dr Rossa Donovan to talk about the other existential crisis making our industry nature positive. So just a little bit of a bio about Rossa. So Dr Rossa Donovan joined Nature Positive, which is part of the RSK group, as a technical director in January 2022. He is a chartered ecologist and sustainability expert with more than 25 years experience, which he's gained across academic, consultancy and public sectors. Prior to joining Nature Positive, Rossa was head of environmental and sustainability at Network Rail, where he led Network Rail's sustainability strategy. During his time at Network Rail, Rossa worked with colleagues across the business and the rail sector to develop the Network Rail's most ambitious and forward-looking strategy to date. A 30-year strategy covering decarbonisation, biodiversity, climate change adaptation and circular economy, including science-based targets to reach net zero by 2050 and targets to achieve no net loss of biodiversity by 2024 and biodiversity net gain by 2035. Prior to this, Rossa was Director of Ecology Services at WSP and Head of Ecology at WYG, which is now Tetra Tech. So without further ado, I think hopefully people will be aware of these sorts of sessions. So any questions that you've got for Rossa, please pop them in the chat function, and we will take those after Rossa has finished his presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Rossa. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks everyone for inviting me along today to talk about the other existential crisis making our industry nature positive.
Yeah. And the thing is, he seems to be fairly reasonable.
So just the contents of my talk then is, first of all, I'll introduce biodiversity and I'll talk.
Apologies, Rossa, sorry, I think we've got you on mute. A few technical glitches here. So just for those that are joining, can we just make sure that your cameras and your microphones are muted? Thank you.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Brilliant. Okay, thank
you.
Okay, right, I'll start again then. Thank you everyone for inviting me along here today. So I'm going to talk about sorry, I'm just trying to get this to work right. The other existential crisis making our industry nature positive. For my talk, I'm going to talk about introduce biodiversity. I'm going to make the case for why biodiversity is, as if not more important than the carbon crisis that we're currently seeing. And then I'm going to start to talk about how we can sort of become more sustainable as businesses or organisations. And I'll sort of start talking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how they can be used to assess sustainability performance. I'll then talk a bit about biodiversity baseline and footprint assessments and what you need to do in order to understand your business's, organisation's relationship with nature. And then I'll talk a bit about setting targets, and then finally what the sort of things that you need to report or how you go about reporting the sort of work that you're doing in terms of making the world a more nature positive place. So start off with the basics and what's biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth, so it includes everything from bacteria to all species of animals and plants and the genetic diversity within those species. And the interactions between those species are known as ecosystems. These are complex systems, but from these interactions we derive all the goods and services that sustain human life. So the message here is biodiversity is complicated, but without it, we wouldn't be able to survive on the planet. So nature is obviously fundamental to our survival. So just a bit of context then is sort of what's happened over the past 10,000 years. You find environmental scientists look back 10,000 years, they look back further, but the past 10,000 years we've seen massive change to the Earth, the surface of the Earth, and what's happened as humans came along. So humans came along around 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Then they started farming, and they really started sort of to modify the landscape and the planet in a massive way. They started farming livestock, and so they started creating an imbalance between the number of farmed animals, if you like, and the sort of number of wild animals. And if we look at the current day, this is 2015, so fairly current, but human biomass is now about 10 times that of wild animals, as is bovine biomass, so cows. And if you look at the biomass of livestock, it's about 20 times that of wild animals. And I'm saying wild animals, we're just looking at mammals here, so this is all animals. And this graph doesn't include poultry, and poultry are now the most numerous bird. Chickens are the most numerous bird in the world, and their biomass is 2 times that of wild birds. And whilst we're farming that, we need to remember that not only do humans rely on nature for their very survival, but so do wild animals. So it's all about the carrying capacity of the world. We are sort of overburdening it in the way that we actually have developed in the past 10,000 years. So I'm going to talk a bit now about ecosystem services. So why is nature so important? Well, it basically gives us everything we need, as I've already said. So from a provisioning point of view, it gives us things like food, minerals, fibres, timber, fuels. It also supports the services, so nutrient cycling, soil formation, really, really important. We wouldn't be able to live on the planet without those two sort of cycling systems going on. Gives us a genetic diversity, which gives us medicines and so much other sort of richness in sort of nature. Primary productions, that's when sunlight actually causes photosynthesis, which then sort of grows plants, which we then eat, or we eat animals that eat the plants, and also habitat formation. So it just gives a diversity of areas where different species can live. But it also has things like regulating services, so things like carbon management. We know, I'm sure everyone knows how cutting down the rainforest is bad for the planet because it's basically releasing carbon into it and also taking away the sink of carbon. So you cut down the rainforest, it's a double whammy in a way. Basically, you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere, but you've also taken away the thing that's actually absorbing carbon in the first place. They do lots of other things like climate regulation, flood regulation, prevent erosion of topsoil, but also water purification. Without nature, we wouldn't have pure water on the planet. And also pollination, and without pollination, we clearly wouldn't have things like food, certain foodstuffs. And I think also we understood, certainly in lockdown, how important nature was for our well-being. We were only allowed out of the house for sort of an hour at a time to go and do exercise, and lots of people said how important nature was and how they got really started connecting with nature during that sort of lockdown period. So it's really important for our mental well-being and for our recreational and spiritual activities. But the interesting fact is there's been quite a lot of work looking at nature and our relationship with nature. And the World Economic Forum did a study, and they found that over half of global GDP is either highly or moderately dependent on nature. So about $44 trillion a year is directly dependent on nature in one way or another. And that's massive. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. I was really shocked when I saw that. But because, we need all of those services in order to actually not only support our own well-being, but also to run our businesses and trade and commerce and so on. It's all sort of related, it all sort of links back to nature. If you look at the comparison to climate change, the World Economic Forum also did a study looking at what would happen if we failed to act on climate change, and it showed that global economy or global GDP could shrink by about 16%. So clearly, just those two figures in themselves show that nature is incredibly important and potentially more important than climate change and the climate crisis that we see at the moment. So this graph sort of shows what's driving the world's species to extinction. And I think it's quite useful in that it's sort of it's taken from lots of data from across lots of different academic studies. It's published in Nature, so it's a very good sort of source. And what they found was that about 40% of the world's amphibians, 25% of mammals, 13% of birds are threatened with extinction currently. And also there's many plants, fungi, etc. that are also threatened with extinction, but they're less studied than those groups there. But also the biggest threats in order of impact are crop farming and deforestation, and the biggest threats by far, and then followed by hunting and fishing, and then followed by human development and habitat fragmentation. And climate change is important. It does have an impact on driving species to extinction, but it's sort of way down the list. And so it's mainly the way that we're modifying the landscape and the way that we're over exploiting sort of natural populations of, for example, fish and animals is the reason why species are becoming extinct. So hopefully that sets the scene for why biodiversity is so important and why it is in effect the other existential crisis. Now I'm going to sort of move on to how we might go about starting to become more nature positive or more sustainable in whatever you do as a company, as an organisation. There's certainly a massive increase in this area of interest in this area now, where people are starting to think, well, what can we do? They're starting to set targets for, you know, carbon and so on. And whilst that's a big challenge in itself, people are now starting to begin to think about nature and what they need to do from a biodiversity point of view, and you know, Nature Positive has been set up to help companies to do that. So hopefully you're all familiar with this picture. It's United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, split into tiers, if you like: economy, society, and biosphere. And this is a particularly helpful diagram, I think, basically because it shows that the biosphere is at the base. It's the basis of everything that we rely on, and society lives on the biosphere, and the economy is sort of nestled within society, if you like. So it's a particularly good model from my point of view, and it's one I like to use. But from a biodiversity point of view, if you were just looking at biodiversity point of view, whilst you might try to achieve all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, if you were just going to look at biodiversity, you'd be particularly interested in number 15, life on land, 14, life below water, 13, climate action, and then 6, clean water and sanitation. And that's not to say there isn't sort of overlap as well. A lot of the companies we work with will sort of overlap when they're talking about biodiversity. I'll talk about sustainable cities and communities. That's number 11. They'll also talk about responsible consumption and production, number 12. But ultimately, you know, companies should be working towards all of those goals, but may want to prioritise things like biodiversity as a separate package of works. So how do we do this then? Well, Nature Positive has come up with a tool that we call SDG IQ, and what happens there is that basically we'll sit down with the company, we'll ask them, that we'll take them through the tool where there's a lot of questions about, you know, are you doing anything about biodiversity, and we'll score them appropriately, and you'll get a sort of radar diagram such as this, which will basically show you where you're performing well and where you're underperforming, and where you've got some work to do, if you like, for the different areas. And the three targets here we've got direct operations, upstream operations, downstream operations, is quite typical for many companies, and it's not criticism, it's just you know, what we see. Many companies are quite aware of their direct operations, the things that they have within their sphere of influence and control, the things within their financial control. They'll have a good understanding of the impacts they're having. Quite commonly, they'll have less of a detailed picture or an understanding of what's happening upstream. So if you think about, I don't know, buying copper, for example, you'll buy it from, you know, a merchant, a supplier who's UK based, or maybe, you know, Europe based or something, and all you're interested in is buying copper. What you don't understand is where that copper's coming from. You don't ask questions, you know, a lot of people just don't stop to think about it. But that copper could be being mined in an area of very high biodiversity, for example, and that copper mine could be causing lots of environmental damage. When you buy it as in purified form, there's no, there's no reason why you would understand where that copper came from. So it's important then that you look at your upstream operations, the whole sort of value chain upstream, and also the downstream operations as well. And again, companies have got generally a better understanding of what's happening in their downstream operations, because they're generally more closer to their sort of distributors and the people who sort of process their waste and so on. And it's generally a much shorter value chain, if you like, than the upstream value chain. So you can do that, so you can separate it down into the different aspects, and then you can come up with an overall score as well. And this will give you just a very good, easy to understand sort of picture of what you're doing from a sustainability point of view and how your company is moving to meet the sort of SDG goals. So yeah, and with the SDG IQ tool, you can sort of download reports which provides more information and suggestions and actions for what to do next and how to improve. So I'm going to talk now about biodiversity baseline and footprint assessments. So this is to I've already talked about looking at your direct impacts, your direct impacts, your upstream, your downstream. So biodiversity baseline and footprint assessments help you do that. So a biodiversity baseline assessment will help you identify your direct impacts on nature, and it will also help you to understand where your greatest risks to your business lies. So overexploitation of a particular natural resource may have implications for your business model and the viability of the business going forward. Direct impacts will generally occur from activities and sites over which the company has direct operational or financial control. And they're the obvious baseline assessments, the obvious starting point for any company wanting to explore. So you need to understand your direct operations before you start thinking about your indirect operations and impacts, and to actually start understanding what your relationship with nature is, because from a direct point of view, that's the area where you can have the most impact, great sphere of influence, and take the most immediate positive actions for biodiversity. How do we do it then? Well, we use global data sets to identify important areas for conservation. So there's many data sets out there that we can tap into. We can look at where your sites are, excuse me, where they're based across the world. We can also do that for your supply chain, which I'll come on to in a bit. We can sort of work out from the activities that are carried out at those sites the likelihood that you're going to impact on the nature conservation areas or the areas of nature around your sites. So we can do this for all of your sites, or if you've got a very big portfolio, we can look at relevant subset of your sites, find out more about the main activities, processes carried out, and we'd largely do this from a best-based point of view, because the global data sets are out there. But in some cases we may require site visits, but we with each site we will look at the sort of potential pathways that could impact on nature, so either through air, water, soil, etc., that may affect any sort of sensitive ecological receptors that are within the vicinity. And then a biodiversity footprint assessment then basically looks at your indirect impacts and dependencies. So you could liken this to scope 3 emissions, if you like, if you were talking about carbon footprint. So it looks at everything in your value chain, so both upstream and downstream, and in many cases the impacts in your value chain are likely to be many times greater than your direct impacts, and that's very similar to what we find when we're looking at carbon footprints as well. The emissions in the scope 3 and the value chain tend to be much higher than those direct emissions. And upstream impacts can come from, for example, manufacture and transport of the infrastructure components or chemicals that you need to operate your business. And downstream impacts might include things like pollution, or impacts from the decommissioning of assets. So, for example, we've worked with lots of energy companies, so things like PCBs, sulfur hexafluoride, and so on are really, really important from their point of view in terms of when they're decommissioning their assets. So once you've sort of understood your footprint, your baseline, if you like, you'll then want to start thinking about setting targets. And there's many ways you can set targets. Lots of companies just have single targets, want to get to net gain, 10% net gain or whatever, and that's the approach we took at Network Rail. Fortunately, now there's much more sophisticated ways of setting targets. And because biodiversity is a lot more complex than, say, carbon, for example, so with carbon, it's very easy just to measure tons of carbon and to set a target for net zero tons of carbon and to draw a graph which gives you a pathway to get to net zero from now to 2050 or whenever you want to do it. Biodiversity is a lot more complex, as we've already established, and so we need a better model to do that. Unfortunately, the Science-Based Targets Network has been working on this Science-Based Targets for Nature model, which is completely aligned with the Science-Based Targets for Carbon model. So you can actually set yourself science-based targets, nature and carbon, and they sort of fit together, if you like. They're sort of designed to actually go side by side. So what are they then? Well, they're built on an understanding of the nature-related risks facing business. So there's been, panels of people that have been working on this for several years. And the message that they've sent out is like, as with carbon, while some of the risks are down the road, greatest risks facing companies today is inaction. So, time is running out. We really do need to start sort of doing something about this. But like science-based targets for carbon, they consider impacts from a company's direct operations and the indirect ones in their supply chain. They also consider value chain adjacent areas, and that's because nature operates within a wider landscape, seascape or watershed. And they also consider the systems, so the systems such as financial systems, industry practice and corporate influence. So it's sort of, if you like, the whole gamut of potential influences that can be sort of used together to actually sort of create science-based targets. It's a 5-step process, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you can find out more about it by Googling science-based targets for nature. But the 5 steps of assess, interpret, prioritise, measure, set and disclose are the sort of very similar to what you would do if you were sort of looking at any sustainability topic, really, in terms of understanding what the main issues are, where in your value chain they occur, what's your sphere of influence, do you need to prioritise any places or any issues, and then to set up a baseline, develop a monitoring plan, set targets, etc., and then to come up with an action plan and apply the ecological mitigation hierarchy, so avoid, reduce, restore, regenerate or transform in order to, as part of your action plan. But importantly, as with the science-based targets for carbon, you should disclose your baseline and your targets and have them verified by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Because then that ties your company into a public sort of, declaration that you're then going to actually try and meet these science-based targets for nature. And this is what they look like. So rather than just a simple, we will reduce carbon by, but we get biodiversity net gain by 10%. It's sort of broken down into the sort of different aspects, if you like, of nature. So you might look at land use change, you might look at resource exploitation, you might look at climate change, both on land and cross realm, and then you also might look at ecosystems and what you might do in there. And whilst I appreciate it's a lot of words on this slide, you can sort of look at it in more detail, but it sort of aligns with, all of this aligns with corporate reporting, global goals and Earth's limits. So it aligns back to all of the sort of sustainable development goals and other things such as the Global Reporting Initiative and so on. So finally, the reporting. It's interesting, we sort of did some work looking at the FTSE 100, and we looked at their annual reports, and we looked at their sustainability strategies and other publicly available documentation, and found that over half of the FTSE 100 companies didn't understand their relationship with nature. They made no reference to biodiversity in many cases, or they just briefly mentioned it in passing, which is quite worrying, really, because these are global multinational, corporate bodies that basically have massive reach across the world in terms of their value chain, and they're not even thinking about biodiversity. And what's happening now is that investors are actually starting to say, well, this isn't good enough. If we're going to invest in your company, we want to see what you're doing from a biodiversity point of view. So have you done any of your due diligence from a biodiversity point of view? Do you understand your relationship with nature, or the impacts that your business model's having on nature, not only in your own country but across the world? And so there's been a lot of work and a lot of pressure, I think, basically in the background, to start saying, well, how do we sort of keep track of what companies are doing? What's the mechanism that we use to actually to encourage corporate reporting from a biodiversity point of view? And so the Taskforce on Nature-related Financial disclosures mechanism was developed. And again, this is purposefully like the Taskforce on Climate-related Financial Disclosures reporting mechanism, so that it's familiar, with the companies are familiar with it. And since the 6th of April this year, something like 1,300 companies in the UK have had to start reporting against the Taskforce on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and so they're going to have to start thinking about this. And the hope is that then that the nature-related financial disclosures will follow suit and become mandatory for companies to start looking at, so that we can help, obviously, drive forward together, action on both the biodiversity and climate crisis. So the purpose of the TNFD is expected to support the shift in finance by providing a framework for organisations to report and act on nature-related risks, in order to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and toward nature positive outcomes. Now, I was horrified, and I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, about the amount of subsidy that is given to nature damaging, nature negative outcomes. So oil exploration and gas exploration, mining, all of those sort of things, many cases are subsidised. And in many cases are done in a very nature negative way. I'm not saying that we don't need them, but they're subsidised, and so we're sort of destroying nature on the cheap, if you like. And so the whole point of this is to basically shift that balance, so that we start to then start to invest in things which are actually good for nature. So the TNFD framework's been designed for both investors and financial institutions, analysts, big corporates, and even small corporates, regulators, stock exchanges, accounting firms, and then things like environmental, social and governance, data providers, credit rating agencies, and financial data and infrastructure providers. So sort of everyone in the business world, really, it can use the TNFD in order to start thinking about what a company's relationship with nature is. And it's got, embedded within this, it has a tool called LEAP, locate, evaluate, assess, prepare, and all this does is sort of help businesses understand the steps they need to take to understand what their relationship with nature is. And Nature Positive sort of helps companies follow this process, takes them through it, so that they can then get themselves ready to be able to start reporting on their nature-related financial disclosures. And in terms of its core elements, again, it's very much like the Taskforce on Climate-related financial disclosures, in that it's got the same four, core elements, if you like. So it needs governance. So, that governance needs to be at a board level, or certainly a senior management team level. so they understand the risks, the dependencies and the opportunities. It needs to be tied into the strategy, so that and sort of help so that they can identify actual and potential impacts and dependencies on nature and the risks and opportunities for business strategy and financial planning. So it's not only in the sustainability strategy, but within the business strategy as well. The two need to be sort of linked. And also risk management. This is a risk. If an ecosystem collapsed and a particular company relied on that ecosystem for their future viability, then their company would stop, or would have to, or it would disrupt their business model. So it's in their interest to actually sort of to manage that ecosystem responsibly. So a really good example of that, I think, is probably the interplay between sort of tourism and overfishing. Both actors have an interest in the sea or the marine environment being healthy, because it attracts tourists, attracts money to those island communities, but also you need a healthy fish stock in order to survive as well. So the governance framework needs to think about risk management, how to sort of how to assess and manage nature-related risks, and obviously you need metrics. You need to be able to measure. You need targets to be able to work towards, and you also need metrics, appropriate metrics, which will help you understand where you are along that journey in terms of meeting those targets. And I'm going to end there. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Ross. There's some interesting statistics as well at the beginning with regards to extinction. So yeah, I think we've all got a part to play in this, both corporately and professionally and personally. So thank you. So I have put in the chat function. If you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or even raise your hand. So we've got a couple. So we'll start with Luke. So Luke's question: what is the cost to a business to undergo an SDG assessment?
It's not as much as you think. I mean, I think it depends on the business. I mean, I'll give it, it'll be the sort of 10-ish thousands of pounds, something like that. It's not going to be a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things. We can always, come to us and talk to us, and we can work out what it needs to be from the size of your business, really.
Excellent, thank you.
Sort of depends how big your supply chain is, but we can do it, relatively cheaply.
Yes. Okay. So another point here. So Alexandra: shocked but not surprised with the impact of the urban development. How can we encourage local authorities and developers to take biodiversity seriously? In most scenarios, it's often only assessed after the works are completed, and feels like there needs to be more government enforcement with this subject.
Absolutely right. Yes. I've been an ecologist, a planning ecologist for a number of years, and it is pretty poor in terms of the governance, if you like, of protecting nature during development cycles. I think I think policy is becoming more strategic now, certainly in the UK, in terms of understanding that creating lots of little, a little pond in every single development doesn't really work, and to actually sort of pool resources into making sort of more cohesive, joined up, effective sort of nature reserves or whatever, which are funded by developers and then sort of maintained by either local authority or wildlife trusts. And in some ways that's the way to do it. I think I've worked on many sites where you've got a strip of grassland, you've got a tree in the corner, you've got a tiny little pond, and you put some bat boxes up on the buildings, and you go back year after year and no bats actually live in them at all. And it's just it's demoralizing actually, because you put so much effort into actually trying to do your best to meet the regulations and stuff like that. So I think people are now starting to do, and certainly Natural England is starting to take a much more strategic view of how we do this, and start thinking about things at a landscape scale, which is the way they should have been doing it all along, rather than just sort of. So biodiversity net gain won't necessarily be on the same site now, but more likely to be in the same locality, if you like, or same local area, but would be a much bigger, much better designed, rewilded site, for example.
Okay. So Rama has asked, any suggestions on how to incorporate SDGs or such awareness in the organisational culture amongst the employees?
That's a really interesting one. The culture's really difficult. I worked in Network Rail. It's a very sort of staid culture, I suppose, 40,000 people. The way that I did it was I went to the very top, so I went and spoke to the CEO. I got half an hour with him, convinced him that we really need to start thinking about this responsibly. We wouldn't have got a 30-year strategy had I not done that. But then I also started engaging with the young people, because a lot of the young people care about this. They're much more well informed than, say, some of the more dyed-in-the-wool people are. And they want change. They want to go and work for a company that basically cares about the planet, cares about people, isn't going around sort of just destroying the world and so on. So it's a case of a bit of influence at board level, get the board on side, but also get that grassroots sort of support as well.
Excellent. Luke has asked, do you find that many companies are willing to make changes to their upstream suppliers / processes after an assessment, or do they simply lay the blame on those upstream companies? If it's not written in legislation, I imagine many companies are reluctant to spend more on a sustainable upstream.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think on the whole, I've found that people have actually asked to look at this, look at their upstream sort of, impacts and stuff, are doing it because they care and it's important to them. It's important for their reputation or their sort of, a competitive advantage within a sector or an industry or something like that. And so they do. I mean, my biggest example of it is in the rail sector, when we looked at it from a carbon point of view, basically. So we started saying to our tier 1 suppliers, you need to start setting science-based targets for carbon. And many of them are already there. Many of them are already ahead of the curve, because they weren't just working for Network Rail, they were working for the Highways England and other companies and so on. So, and they realised that it was giving them competitive advantage if they actually did that. The difficulty then is when you go down to the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, where you're starting to move into the SME territory, where you've got some very, people don't have big sustainability budgets. They don't have a sustainability team. It's there's one man, it's one person with sort of 20 people reporting to them, and they don't understand it and stuff like that. So you sort of do need to work with them. And I dare say there are companies out there that basically just sort of try and push it down the line, down the value chain, and get people to do it. But as with, if you're looking at from science-based targets, carbon point of view, it's about setting your own targets for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then doing what you can in your supply chain, or having meaningful action in the supply chain. So it's not about solving it entirely, but it's about raising awareness and sort of, setting higher standards, or going and using different suppliers,
Enforcing that. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, I think Rama's just typing one more question, I think, and then the pressure's now on for Rama to type quickly. If you want to put your hand up and ask a question, feel free. That's also fine. Okay, all good. All right, thank you. And thank you to everyone joining, and more importantly, thank you to Rossa today. Really insightful, and I think certainly from my perspective, especially with the Guild and then with UKSTT as well, this Green Alliance is about innovation, it's about technology, but fundamentally we've all play a part with looking after the environment and ensuring that we're leaving a legacy for future generations. So thank you very much for your time today. And as I say, thank you to everybody that's dialed in. Our next Green Alliance webinar is going to take place on the 8th of September, and that will be with Scottish Water. So again, please look out for on our events page, and the same with UKSTT's website for more information on how to book for those events. So without further ado, thank you very, very much. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Thursdays, and yeah, take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Rossa. Thank you, Kate.